The camera fades into the image of an abandoned building, an asylum half swallowed by time. Cracked windows, vines crawling across the walls, and a single sign barely hanging on a rusted nail, Hillsview State Hospital. The narrator's voice begins, soft but heavy with weight. They were supposed to tear it down quietly. Just another condemned building. Just another relic of a forgotten past. But then, on the third day of demolition, something beneath the floor began to move. Cut to archival shots, black and white photographs of the asylum during its early years. The staff in pressed uniforms, rows of patients staring blankly into the lens, sunlight filtered through barred windows. The workers on site describe it like this: a hollow noise, faint at first, like someone knocking from inside the walls. They thought it was just an animal. Or maybe the sound of the excavator echoing through the empty hallways. But then, the sound happened again. 3 knocks. Slow. Rhythmic. Coming from under the floorboards. One of the foremen, Michael Grayson, remembers it vividly. His voice trembles slightly as he recounts it on camera. You could feel it, not just hear it. Like something was breathing down there. We thought it might be a gas pocket or an old pipe shifting, so we pried up the boards, and that's when we saw the hatch. The narrator lowers their voice. The hatch was old, sealed with layers of dust and rust. No handles. No markings. And when they checked the blueprints of the asylum, that hatch wasn't supposed to exist. Cut to a shot of the discovered trapdoor, photographed by a demolition crew member on his phone. A square of corroded metal embedded in cracked wood, surrounded by splintered beams. A faint draft leaks through a gap at its edge, cold enough to make the camera lens fog. The workers contact their supervisor. The area is sealed for safety. But word spreads fast. Within hours, the local historical society arrives, along with a structural engineer and a representative from the city's preservation office. Everyone wants to see what's down there. They remove the debris carefully, peeling back decades of neglect. The air grows heavier, almost suffocating. Dust swirls in the light of a single flashlight. Someone mutters, "It smells wrong." The narrator pauses for effect, a slow heartbeat rhythm building beneath the voiceover. At first, they think it's mold. Or decay from old medical supplies left behind. But then the engineer notices something strange. The boards above the hatch had been reinforced from the outside. Someone wanted to make sure, whatever was down there, never came back up. A long silence follows. Only the faint creak of metal being unscrewed. The team pries open the hatch. The hinges groan like something exhaling after 50 years of holding its breath. The smell hits first, thick, metallic, and stale. Then comes the cold, a sudden draft rising from absolute darkness. One of the workers shines his flashlight down the hole. The beam disappears almost instantly, swallowed by the dark. He lowers a small inspection camera through the opening. The screen flickers. Static. And then, for a split second, an image. Concrete walls. A narrow corridor. Something metallic glinting in the beam. The footage cuts. The room below the floorboards wasn't listed on any blueprint. Not from the original 1908 construction plans. Not from the 1947 remodel. Not even from the final inspection before the asylum was shut down. The camera returns to the decaying hallway. The narrator's voice now sharper, still calm, but with growing tension. What they had found wasn't a maintenance tunnel. It wasn't a storage cellar. It was something else, something deliberately built, and then erased from history. A historian from the local university speaks on camera, flipping through old government archives. We went through hundreds of pages of blueprints. Not a single mention of a sublevel, or even a sealed chamber beneath that section of the building. And yet, when we scanned the foundation, the radar picked up a void, a hollow space running almost 30 feet long. That room had been there all along. Cut to the narrator, It was as if the building itself had tried to hide its secret. The team prepares to open the hatch fully. They bring in lights, respirators, and cameras. The plan is to send 2 workers down first, attached to safety lines. But before they can, something unexpected happens. As they lift the final section of rotted wood, the air pressure shifts, a low moan echoes through the corridor, like the building is groaning from its foundation. Dust rains from the ceiling. The power flickers. And then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The foreman shouts for the generator to be reset, but no one moves. Every person in that room feels it, that something down there is aware of them. Watching. Waiting. The narrator whispers, when they finally shined the light into the opening again, they saw stairs. Narrow, steep, and descending into the dark. A staircase that shouldn't exist, leading to a place no one ever registered. The camera zooms slowly toward the open hatch, the darkness swallowing the frame until there's nothing left but the faint sound of the wind through the broken windows. The narrator's voice returns over the faint hum of wind sweeping through abandoned hallways. The camera pans across the derelict building, daylight bleeding weakly through cracked stained glass, dust drifting like ghosts in slow motion. Before we can understand what was found beneath Hillsview's floors, we have to understand what Hillsview was. And what it was never meant to be. Cut to faded black and white footage, men in long coats, women clutching paper files, the camera shaking slightly, early 1900s documentary footage of the hospital's grand opening. A brass plaque reads, Hillsview State Recovery Center, for the care and rehabilitation of the mind. The narrator continues, when Hillsview opened in 1909, it was hailed as a model of modern psychiatry, a place of healing, not punishment. But if you ask the people who live nearby, they'll tell you something else entirely. The visuals shift to old photographs, skeletal trees surrounding the main building, a narrow road leading to a locked iron gate. A local historian, Margaret Lane, speaks on camera. Her office is cluttered with maps, yellowed clippings, and photographs of the asylum in its prime. Back then, mental health wasn't understood the way it is now. Hillsview promised to correct what society called disturbances, depression, anxiety, even grief. They believed the mind could be rewired through discipline and isolation. Archival records appear on screen, typed case files stamped, cured, and transferred. Yet half of the patient lists end abruptly, names crossed out without explanation. The narrator lowers their voice. Between 1911 and 1928, over 300 patients were admitted to Hillsview. Only a fraction were ever recorded as discharged. The rest simply disappeared. Cut to sound design, faint footsteps, muffled voices, doors slamming shut. Rumors began circulating, of treatment wings closed off without warning, of staff forbidden to enter certain corridors, of midnight transfers that never appeared in official logs. Enter the figure who defined the institution's legacy, Dr. Alastair Finch. Archival portrait, a tall man with hollow eyes, immaculate suit, and a faint, unreadable smile. Dr. Finch took over as superintendent in 1923. A brilliant neurologist with revolutionary ideas, and an obsession with control. His surviving letters narrate through voiceover, madness, he wrote, is not illness but rebellion of the spirit. To cure the mind, one must first break it. The narrator lets the words linger, heavy, unsettling. Finch's methods were experimental even for his time, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, electrotherapy far beyond accepted doses. Nurse logs from 1925 mention extended confinements and patients returned unable to speak. Some entries are smeared, as though someone tried to erase them. Then, a sudden image flashes, a grainy photo of the asylum's eastern wing, now collapsed, overlaid with a chilling statistic, 22 patients transferred, records missing. The narrator continues, even Hillsview's own staff began to vanish. A janitor dismissed after asking about the locked basement corridor. 2 nurses resigning the same week after what they called an unauthorized procedure. But none of this appeared in official reports. In fact, the asylum's paperwork, meticulous until 1924, abruptly skips 3 consecutive years. Margaret Lane flips through the archives again, showing blank sections in government ledgers. It's not a clerical error. The pages weren't missing, they were never written. The story deepens. During that silent 3-year gap, Hillsview received unusually large private donations. Financial ledgers show funds labeled Project Restoration. No one knows who the donors were. The signatures are illegible, or deliberately obscured. The narrator adds, someone, somewhere, wanted Hillsview's work to continue, quietly, and without oversight. A cut to a local newspaper headline from 1931, Patient's family demands answers, Hillsview refuses statement. Below it, a black-and-white portrait of a young woman named Eleanor Ward, age 23. Her family claimed she was admitted for postpartum depression. Within 6 months, she was gone. The asylum sent only a 1-sentence reply, patient transferred to state care facility. No such transfer was ever recorded. The camera slowly zooms out from Eleanor's photograph as the narrator speaks. It was around this time that locals began to whisper a phrase, the lower wing. A place where the real experiments took place. A place no visitor ever saw. A retired orderly, Thomas Riley, provides the first direct testimony. You could hear it sometimes at night, machinery running somewhere below. The walls would vibrate, like there was a generator under the floor. But there wasn't. At least, not in any plans I ever saw. His hand shakes slightly as he shows an old ID card, faded, but still legible. We weren't supposed to talk about it. Finch made sure of that. The narrator interjects, when the state finally audited Hillsview in 1949, inspectors found entire wings sealed off. Doors welded shut. Rooms stripped of furniture, as if someone had scrubbed the building clean of its own history. But one discovery stood out, the blueprints. Stored in the county's construction archives, the original drawings of Hillsview show 3 floors above ground. And yet, one early draft, dated months before completion, includes something else, a 4th level marked only as Subbasement A. That version was never submitted for approval. The narrator whispers, if that drawing is real, it means the asylum was built with a floor that officially never existed. Cut to eerie visuals, the faint outline of blueprints laid over drone footage of the crumbling building. Lines don't align. Rooms overlap where they shouldn't. The voice grows quieter, more deliberate. Maybe the blueprints were changed later. Or maybe, from the very beginning, Hillsview was never meant to heal anyone at all. As thunder rumbles in the distance, the narrator sets the tone for what's to come. They built a place to hide the broken. Then they built another place to hide what they did to them. A slow fade transitions back to the present, the demolition site. The hatch from Section 1 sits open in the dust, surrounded by yellow tape. When those workers lifted the floorboards, they didn't just open a room. They opened the one part of Hillsview the world was never meant to see. The camera slowly tilts downward into the hatch again, that same cold draft breathing out of the darkness. A caption fades in over black, the missing years. 1924 to 1927. The narrator whispers one final line before the section ends, what happened during those years would haunt everyone who entered that room. The sound came first, faint, rhythmic, and impossibly human. At 2 a.m, when a night shift nurse, Clara Devane, passed the east corridor of the abandoned asylum wing, she paused mid-step. The corridor was supposed to be empty, condemned for decades, but what she heard made her freeze, a soft knocking behind the plastered walls, slow and deliberate, as if someone trapped inside was tapping for help. Clara's flashlight flickered across the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of dust, bleach, and something faintly metallic. She called out, "Maintenance," but her voice came back hollow, echoing through the long, sterile hall. The tapping stopped, then resumed, faster this time. Panic rippled through her chest. She dropped her clipboard and sprinted toward the security desk. That same night, security logs show a 3-minute power fluctuation in the East Wing, no cameras, no lights, no trace of what caused it. When power returned, the knocking had stopped completely. But something new had appeared. Behind the thin layer of plaster in room 213, maintenance workers later discovered a thin hairline crack, as if something beneath the wall had shifted. 2 days later, a report landed on the desk of Dr. Michael Armitage, the hospital's director. The report described unexplained noises and wall damage and requested immediate structural review. Armitage, known for his rigid rationalism, dismissed it as rodent movement or pipe resonance. But Clara wouldn't let it go. She swore she'd heard a voice, a whisper between the knocks. When interviewed later, her testimony was almost trembling. It wasn't just random. It sounded like someone counting, slowly, 1, 2, 3, then it stopped. What she didn't know then, and what would only emerge much later, was that the number 3 appeared again and again in the asylum's hidden history: 3 unexplained deaths, 3 missing patient files, 3 basement locks that led to nowhere. The maintenance crew began chipping away at the damaged wall a week later. Beneath layers of paint and old insulation, they found a cavity, a hollow section that shouldn't have existed according to blueprints. Inside, there was nothing but old dust and a brittle scrap of paper wedged between 2 wooden beams. On it, written in smudged graphite, were 3 words: "Still down here." The crew stopped immediately, thinking it was a prank. But Clara recognized the handwriting. It matched one of the old patient files she'd archived the previous year, a file belonging to patient Eliza Rourke, committed in 1938 for violent night terrors and presumed dead after a fire in the West Ward. Records show her body was never recovered. When Clara brought the discovery to Dr. Armitage, he ordered the area sealed off until further investigation. But word spread fast among the night staff. Orderlies whispered about the girl in the wall, while janitors refused to work near room 213 after dark. Strange noises intensified, footsteps without bodies, whispers carried through vents, faint laughter caught between echoes. By the end of the month, 5 staff members had resigned, citing psychological stress and unexplained auditory disturbances. Dr. Armitage ordered silence. Official memos described the issue as structural settling. But Clara, obsessed with finding answers, started staying after her shifts, recording sounds on an old tape recorder she borrowed from the therapy ward. The recordings, later analyzed by investigators decades later, captured faint words buried under the hum of electrical current. A slow, gasping voice could be heard repeating, "Don't open the floor." It was around this time that a maintenance blueprint from 1902 resurfaced in the city archives. It showed that beneath the asylum's east wing lay a sealed sub-basement, built for containment of unregistered patients during the early 20th century, a grim euphemism for those society wanted forgotten. No access points were marked except one, beneath the east corridor floorboards, right where Clara first heard the knocking. Late one night, Clara snuck back into the corridor, driven by a mixture of fear and compulsion. She peeled back the warning tape, set her recorder on the floor, and knelt by the wall. "Eliza," she whispered. The air grew heavy, the way it does before a storm. Then, just as she was about to stand, a cold draft swept from beneath the floorboards, air that smelled of damp stone and rot. Her flashlight dimmed. The knocking returned. This time, it wasn't behind the wall, it was underneath her. The next morning, security footage showed Clara walking into the East Wing at 2:17 a.m. She never re-emerged. Her car remained in the staff lot, her locker untouched. The recorder was later found 3 feet from the wall, tape still spinning, capturing a final, distorted sound, a single word, stretched and warping through static, beneath. Dr. Armitage filed her disappearance under voluntary leave. But his private diary, recovered years later, revealed a different story. He wrote, "Something is wrong beneath the asylum. The walls hum at night. The staff are leaving. And I dream of a voice calling from under the floor. That diary entry was dated October 17, 1954, the same night another nurse, Agnes Fry, claims she heard a woman crying from beneath the tiles. For decades, the building remained operational, its east wing permanently closed off. Yet those who worked night shifts reported the same phenomena, the rhythmic knocks, the faint counting, and, every few months, the unmistakable smell of damp earth seeping up from the cracks. Years later, when the asylum finally shut down in 1986, contractors began preparing the building for demolition. That's when they made the decision to dig beneath the floorboards of the old East Wing, to finally discover what lay below. They expected foundation stone, maybe a tunnel. What they found wasn't on any record at all. And when the first beam was lifted, when the ground gave way to the hollow beneath, a rush of cold air escaped, smelling like time itself. Whatever was trapped there had been waiting for decades. And now, it was awake. The morning they started digging, the air around the old asylum felt unnaturally still. The contractors, 7 men hired from the local union, had been told the job was simple: break through the east wing floor, assess the foundation, and seal it up. None of them knew what had happened there 30 years earlier. None of them knew about Clara. At 8:45 a.m., the first sledgehammer struck the wood. The board splintered easily, releasing a burst of stale air that smelled of rust and wet limestone. Beneath the rotting timber was a layer of compacted soil, darker than expected, almost black. As they cleared away more earth, one of the workers, Luis Moreno, noticed something odd: an outline carved into the foundation stone. It wasn't a crack. It was a door frame, perfectly rectangular, bricked over long ago. Luis called the foreman, Ed Cartwright, who crouched beside the opening. The bricks were aged but solid, mortared with a strange reddish substance that didn't look like standard construction material. When one brick came loose, a faint metallic scent filled the air, sharp and unpleasant. Behind the first row of bricks, darkness. They expected a crawlspace. Instead, when they finally cleared the entrance, they found a descending staircase made of cold, gray stone. It spiraled downward into the earth, far deeper than any basement should go. The blueprints had made no mention of this structure. Ed, uneasy, radioed the project manager, who ordered them to halt until the Historical Preservation Office could assess. But curiosity has a way of breaking rules. Luis switched on his headlamp and took the first step down. "Just a quick look," he said. The others followed, one by one, their boots echoing against the narrow walls. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, covered in faded chalk markings, lines, circles, numbers, all scrawled by hand. About 20 steps down, they reached the bottom, a small landing leading into a corridor that stretched forward into darkness. That's when they noticed the smell, the unmistakable scent of formaldehyde. Ed's flashlight caught something ahead, a glimmer of metal. They advanced cautiously until the beam illuminated a steel door, heavy and rusted, with an inspection window the size of a coin. Across the metal surface were deep scratches, like fingernails dragging across the paint. Above the door, faint but still legible, were words etched into the stone arch: Ward C, unregistered. Luis swore under his breath. None of them spoke for several seconds. Then, against Ed's orders, Luis reached out and turned the handle. It was stiff but not locked. The door creaked open with a long, shuddering groan. Beyond it lay a room the size of a chapel, ceiling low and uneven, walls lined with old iron restraints bolted into stone. In the center of the floor was a long metal table, corroded and bent, surrounded by glass jars, broken tools, and scattered paperwork sealed in plastic that had turned brittle with age. Someone had worked down here, a doctor, maybe, or something far worse. One of the men picked up a folder. The label read, "Patient, Observation Notes." The pages inside were smeared with age, but a few sentences were still readable. Patient exhibits advanced sensitivity to light. Claims to hear movement within walls. repeatedly warned staff not to excavate the lower level. The notes ended abruptly with a line scrawled across the margin, "Containment breach probable." As they flipped through the papers, Louis's light swept across the far corner of the room, where a section of wall appeared different, cleaner, as if it had been replaced. He walked over and pressed his palm against it. Hollow. He rapped his knuckles. The sound echoed deeper than it should have. He turned to Ed. "There's another room behind here." The group exchanged glances. Nobody wanted to keep going, but the weight of discovery, the realization that they'd stumbled upon something forgotten by history, was irresistible. They fetched a crowbar and began prying at the wall. Dust filled the air. Bricks fell away one by one until an opening appeared just large enough for a person to crawl through. Louis shined his light inside. At first, it revealed only darkness and debris. Then, slowly, something came into view, a small chair in the center of a narrow room. Chains hung from the ceiling, attached to metal rings embedded in the floor. Beside the chair, a wooden cabinet stood ajar, filled with objects that made no sense, dolls without faces, jars of preserved organs, and a cracked phonograph with a label that read, "Therapy Recordings, 1939. When they tried to remove the cabinet, a gust of air escaped from behind it, followed by a faint, almost musical hum. The sound was low, continuous, like the vibration of a distant engine. Except it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from below. Louis crouched, pressed his ear to the ground, and froze. There was movement down there, slow, deliberate, rhythmic movement, as though someone were pacing just beneath the stone. "Something's down here," he whispered. The others laughed nervously, but their voices shook. They packed up, left the chamber, and sealed the entrance with a temporary barricade. The historical office arrived 3 days later. But when inspectors descended the same staircase, they found something no one could explain. The room was gone. The door that led to Ward C had been replaced by a solid stone wall, identical to the surrounding foundation. No staircase, no iron table, no jars, no notes. The crew was accused of fabricating the discovery, an impossible claim, since Louis had taken photographs. But when he tried to show them, every image on his camera appeared corrupted, distorted bands of static, light leaks, and in one frame, the faint outline of a human silhouette standing behind him. 2 months later, Louis stopped coming to work. His family reported him missing. When police entered his apartment, they found the walls covered in hand-drawn diagrams of tunnels and corridors. Every drawing led to the same point, marked with a single word in black marker, "Below." Ed Cartwright, the foreman, was interviewed years later for a local news special. His hands trembled as he recounted that morning. "We weren't supposed to find that room. Someone built this place with secrets buried under secrets. And once you open one layer, the others start waking up." After that incident, the asylum's demolition was delayed indefinitely. The site was labeled a historical hazard zone. Researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators all tried to map the structure, but blueprints contradicted each other. Corridors measured longer from the inside than from the outside. Doors changed alignment. And sometimes, new passageways appeared where there hadn't been any before. Dr. Armitage's old diary, recovered from a locked cabinet years after his death, contained one chilling line that seemed to explain everything: the architecture shifts when it's remembered. The deeper investigators dug, the more the building seemed to resist them, walls cracking, power failing, tools vanishing. By the time city officials finally declared the site unsafe, it was too late. The story had already spread. People came from across the country to see the breathing asylum, the one that grew and shrank with memory. What no one realized then was that beneath the lowest recorded level, beyond any mapped corridor, there still existed one final chamber, the one no blueprint ever captured. And that's where the truth still waited, untouched, humming softly in the dark. For decades, the asylum's history was pieced together from fragments, official reports, damaged patient files, and oral testimonies. But the real story, the one that connected the disappearances, the hidden rooms, and the sounds beneath the floorboards, didn't surface until the discovery of Dr. Michael Armitage's journals. The journals were found purely by accident. In 1998, a construction crew renovating an old warehouse on the edge of Black Hollow uncovered a steel lockbox sealed within a wall. The box was stamped with the initials M.A., and contained 16 small leather-bound notebooks, each dated between 1947 and 1955, the final active years of the asylum's operation. The pages were warped by humidity, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Armitage's, precise, clinical, yet increasingly unsteady as the entries progressed. What began as a physician's observations of patient behavior soon spiraled into something darker, a descent into obsession. The first few journals were uneventful, chronicling standard psychiatric cases, hysteria, melancholia, and post-war trauma. But as the years passed, Armitage's tone shifted. His entries grew erratic. He began describing unexplainable architectural phenomena, rooms that appeared in one wing and vanished in another, staircases that ended midair, corridors that led nowhere one day and somewhere entirely new the next. In one entry dated June 3, 1949, he wrote, "The East Corridor grows longer each week. The measurements refuse to remain constant. I've walked it 3 times tonight, once it was 48 paces, then 53, then 61. It's as though the building itself breathes." Another entry read, "Patient claims the walls are alive. I dismissed it as delusion, until I heard the hum myself." That hum appeared repeatedly throughout his writings. He described it as a subsonic vibration that resonated through the structure, strongest near the east wing, particularly beneath the floor where Clara Devane had vanished years earlier. As his obsession deepened, so did his fear. He began isolating himself, writing long confessional passages that blurred the line between science and superstition. "There are rooms here that were never meant to exist," he wrote on November 14, 1950. "And yet they appear when the asylum remembers them. The building is sentient in some primitive way. It feeds on memory, grief, and fear." Researchers who later analyzed the journals noted a curious pattern. Each time Armitage documented a new manifestation, a patient in his ward either vanished, died suddenly, or was transferred without record. The names of those patients appeared again in later entries, underlined, followed by one chilling phrase, "reclaimed by the architecture." The later journals took a more personal turn. Armitage began hearing whispers in his sleep, voices calling him by name. He described dreams of endless hallways filled with locked doors, each marked with the initials of former patients. Behind those doors, he claimed to hear breathing. One entry from March 7, 1952, stood out for its vivid detail: "The blueprints are wrong. The asylum's foundation extends much deeper than recorded. There is a chamber below Ward C, identical to the one above, but inverted, as though mirrored in stone. I believe this is where they kept the unregistered patients. The walls down there pulse when you touch them, faintly warm, like skin." Historians initially dismissed these accounts as delusion brought on by isolation and stress. But the coordinates Armitage scribbled in the margins, once plotted, matched the exact location where Luis Moreno's crew would later find the hidden staircase decades after the asylum's closure. The handwriting in the last journal became increasingly erratic. Sentences looped over themselves, pages stained with what appeared to be blood or rust. He began addressing someone directly, someone he called Eliza. "You told me not to listen. You said the hum grows louder when acknowledged. But it's always there now. It's in the walls. It's beneath my feet." The final entry, dated October 17, 1954, read only, "I heard her knocking again. 3 times. Always 3. I must go below." After that, there were no more entries. No record of Armitage's resignation, no death certificate, no mention in hospital archives. It was as if he'd vanished into the very walls he'd spent years studying. When investigators examined the physical journals, they found something else: small particles embedded in the margins of the paper. Forensic analysis later confirmed it was lime dust, the kind used in early 20th century construction mortar. Meaning, wherever he'd written those final entries, it wasn't in his office. It was underground. A later annotation added by one of the forensic historians noted something chilling: the journals had been sealed within the steel box decades before the asylum's demolition. Which raised an impossible question: who sealed them there? Armitage's writings contained more than delusion, they carried a map. Several sketches within the journals depicted the asylum's underground structure, though drawn from a perspective impossible for a human to have seen, angled from above, as if viewed from the ceiling or higher still. And at the center of every sketch, the same feature appeared: a circular room labeled only, the reflection chamber. No record of such a chamber existed in any blueprint or architectural survey. But every reference to it in Armitage's notes carried the same warning: never uncover the mirrored floor. Researchers believe this was the same area uncovered during the 1986 excavation, the one that caused the final halt to demolition when the crew began reporting distortions in space and sound. In a recorded interview from 2002, Dr. Helen Amirs, a historical psychologist who spent years analyzing Armitage's case, summarized it best: "What's terrifying about his writings isn't the madness, it's the method. He wasn't hallucinating. He was documenting. The pattern, the locations, the sensory details, all match physical evidence later found. If he was insane, then the building itself shared his insanity." The final notebook ended with a single phrase scrawled in large, uneven handwriting across the last page, one that looked almost carved rather than written: "She's still counting." And directly beneath it, a series of 3 dots. When the notebooks were placed in archival storage, a faint humming sound was reported in the containment room. Staff dismissed it as electrical interference. But when they moved the journals to a separate facility, the sound stopped. Some say the hum was never from the journals. It was from what they described. And as one archivist later remarked in an interview, "Sometimes I still hear it when the room goes quiet." For years, the reflection chamber was little more than a legend whispered among the few who dared to research Black Hollow Asylum. The term existed only in Armitage's journals, never in official documents, never in blueprints. Yet every account of the building's anomalies seemed to point toward one central, unseen space buried deeper than the human mind could comfortably imagine. It wasn't until 2004 that the chamber was finally uncovered, accidentally, just like every other discovery tied to this cursed building. A film crew had obtained permission to shoot a paranormal documentary inside the decaying asylum before its scheduled demolition. They were amateurs, mostly thrill-seekers chasing ghost stories, armed with cheap cameras and an overconfidence born from ignorance. But what they found that night was no folklore, it was geometry turned against itself. At approximately 11:42 p.m., during their exploration of the East Wing sublevel, one of the crew members, Eric Landon, noticed a subtle draft flowing through a hairline crack in the concrete wall. When he pressed his flashlight to it, the beam reflected back unnaturally, as though hitting glass. Intrigued, they began chipping away at the wall with a crowbar. The moment the concrete broke open, the air shifted. A low-frequency hum filled the space, resonating through their chests. Behind the wall was a narrow passage, descending by 5 uneven steps into a circular chamber. The air smelled like copper and wet stone. The chamber's walls were made of mirror-polished metal, perfectly smooth, forming a continuous ring without seams. At the center of the floor lay a disc-shaped mirror, cracked, yet still gleaming under the flashlight's beam. The reflection that stared back wasn't theirs. Each member of the crew reported seeing something slightly different. One saw a crowd of figures standing motionless behind the mirrored surface, another saw herself, aged and frail, her eyes hollow, a third claimed to see someone else entirely, a woman with long dark hair, dressed in what looked like a tattered asylum gown, standing directly behind them in the reflection but not in the room. They fled after less than 5 minutes. Only 2 of the 5 made it out of the building. Police later recovered their footage. Most of it was corrupted, except for a short segment lasting 47 seconds. The camera pans across the room, catching glimpses of the mirror and the strange metallic curvature of the walls. Then, faintly, a woman's voice whispers, "You opened it again." Moments later, the footage cuts to black. Investigators reviewing the footage noticed something else. During the final seconds, when the mirror cracks further, a faint pattern appears along the edges, a perfect circle of concentric symbols, identical to those found in Armitage's sketches. Experts who analyzed the chamber's construction materials were baffled. The walls weren't made of standard metal or glass but of an alloy containing mercury traces, impossibly advanced for early 1900s architecture. And the floor mirror, though fractured, seemed fused directly to the foundation, impossible to remove without shattering the entire chamber. The lead forensic engineer described it as a structure built not for containment, but reflection, something designed to trap rather than seal. For months, theorists debated the purpose of the chamber. Some believed it was a sensory isolation room, others argued it was a primitive psychological experiment designed by early psychiatrists. But there was one chilling detail in Armitage's notes that couldn't be ignored. In his 1952 journal, he had written, "The reflection chamber was never meant for therapy. It was meant for observation. The walls show you what the mind denies." Another line followed, "Eliza is no longer outside the mirror." That name, Eliza, appeared again in the film footage transcripts. In the background, just before the recording cuts out, a faint whisper seems to murmur the same word 3 times, growing louder each time until it distorts the microphone. Eliza. 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 Researchers tried to determine if the chamber was acoustically active, capable of generating infrasound that could cause hallucinations. The data, however, defied explanation. The frequencies emanating from the chamber didn't match known acoustic phenomena. Instead of dissipating, the sound waves seemed to loop, feeding back into themselves, as though the room was listening. One scientist who spent a night inside described it later as standing in a space that remembers every sound ever made within it. He resigned 3 days after the experiment, refusing to speak of what he'd heard. Later surveys found the chamber's orientation underground to be spatially impossible. Its position, when mapped, extended beyond the physical boundaries of the asylum foundation. The chamber existed where no space should exist. This discovery led to a shocking hypothesis: the asylum wasn't built over the chamber, it was built around it. Armitage's notes hinted at this years earlier: "We built the hospital to contain the memory, not the patients. The walls hold their echoes, and the echoes are alive." It's believed the reflection chamber predated the asylum entirely, possibly part of an earlier facility or experiment. Local archives contain references to a Mirror Institute in the 1880s, known for unorthodox studies of consciousness and sensory inversion. Its records, however, were destroyed in a fire in 1891, the same year the asylum's construction began. Connecting the dots, modern researchers speculated that Black Hollow Asylum was deliberately built atop the ruins of the Mirror Institute, to bury its experiments. But if that was the case, then someone, perhaps Armitage himself, must have known about the chamber all along. The last documented visit to the reflection chamber occurred in 2013, when a team of state surveyors entered the site for final demolition approval. They recorded humidity, temperature, and magnetic field data. Everything was normal until one of their devices, a motion sensor, began activating repeatedly even when no one was moving. When they played back the audio logs later, they captured faint tapping sounds, 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. The same pattern recorded decades earlier by Clara Devane. One of the surveyors, a man named Paul Garrison, later described what happened when he looked into the mirror. "I didn't see my reflection. I saw myself walking toward me from the other side. Then I blinked, and it was gone." Garrison quit his job that same week. 3 months later, he was found dead in his apartment. His mirrors had all been covered with black cloth. Following the incident, the reflection chamber was declared sealed and permanently restricted by the state. No further research was permitted. But rumors persist that the chamber isn't silent, that it still hums faintly beneath the rubble, waiting for someone to remember it again. A former preservation officer, who visited the site in 2015, gave a haunting testimony. It's like the building wants to be found. Every time you think it's gone, the walls shift. You can almost feel it breathing under your feet. Even after demolition, locals reported strange phenomena at the empty lot, mirages, echoing sounds, and sudden cold drafts. At night, when the wind passes over the foundation stones, some swear they can hear faint laughter, and beneath it, a whisper, "Don't look down." The reflection chamber may have been buried again, but as Armitage wrote in his final notes, burial isn't closure. It's invitation. And somewhere below that forgotten earth, beyond the reach of light and time, the mirror still waits, its surface cracked, its memories restless, reflecting not what was, but what will return. Black Hollow, the small town surrounding the asylum, had always carried whispers of tragedy. Families spoke in hushed tones about missing children, unexplained illnesses, and the strange sounds echoing from the East Wing. But after the asylum's closure and the initial demolitions, a new, more insidious phenomenon began to take hold: collective memory lapses. Residents reported small, disorienting gaps. People would forget entire conversations or misremember dates. Children who played near the asylum's grounds claimed they sometimes saw figures moving in abandoned corridors that weren't there anymore. A woman named Margaret Halloway, who had grown up 2 blocks from the asylum, recalled an odd incident from her childhood. "I remember my brother and I hiding behind the playground fence. I could see the windows light up, hear laughter, but the building wasn't supposed to be occupied. And when I told my parents, they just looked at me like I was imagining things." Local historians initially dismissed such accounts as folklore, exaggerations passed down through generations. But patterns began to emerge. Birth and death records from the town showed discrepancies, years missing from official documents, names that appeared and then vanished. Streets and houses were reported differently in older maps compared to modern ones. Entire neighborhoods seemed to shift in memory, existing one day and disappearing the next. In the early 1990s, a retired schoolteacher, Harold Finch, approached a university research team claiming that entire families in the town had forgotten the asylum existed. His evidence was anecdotal but unsettling. Neighbors who had lived there all their lives could not recall the structure's layout, nor could they identify staff members who had worked there. "People who should remember the nurses, the doctors, the patients," Finch said, "they looked at me blankly, as if I were speaking of a fairy tale." Researchers began interviewing longtime residents. Most reported vivid but inconsistent dreams, recurring visions of corridors, staircases, and mirrored rooms. Some awoke with faint impressions of damp stone under their feet, or the metallic smell of the underground chamber. When pressed, they often corrected themselves mid-sentence, muttering, "That can't be. I must be imagining it." Even more disturbing were the reports of synchronized experiences. Several townspeople claimed that they could hear tapping sounds simultaneously, or sense the presence of someone watching. These episodes were fleeting, but they left a lingering unease, an emotional residue that tied the entire town to the asylum's history, whether consciously remembered or not. Anthropologists studying these phenomena suggested that the reflection chamber and the hidden sublevels may have extended their influence beyond the building itself. The theory was simple, yet terrifying: the asylum had embedded its presence into the surrounding environment, and by extension, into the memories of those living nearby. One case in particular caught the attention of researchers. A man named Joseph Callahan, who lived less than a mile from the East Wing, reported waking one night to find an indistinct figure standing in his kitchen. The figure had no features, but Joseph swore he could feel its eyes on him. He passed out in terror and woke up in the middle of the street, miles from his home, with no recollection of how he got there. When psychologists examined Joseph, they noted that his memory gaps coincided with a cluster of missing persons reports from the 1950s, the same era when the reflection chamber was active and Armitage's journals chronicled unusual activity. Joseph himself had no knowledge of the asylum or its history, yet his experience mirrored the echoes recorded in Armitage's observations decades prior. Even local police were affected. Officers investigating disappearances in Black Hollow often misfiled reports or failed to find evidence that later records confirmed had existed. It wasn't incompetence, it was as if the town itself resisted recollection, erasing the events that took place within its boundaries. The most chilling accounts came from children. Several families reported that their children spoke of corridors beneath the ground, hidden rooms, and whispering voices, long before they could have heard about the asylum from any adult. One young boy described a room with no ceiling and walls like mirrors, matching Armitage's description of the reflection chamber. A retired local journalist, Eleanor Brooks, documented these events in a private journal, noting a pattern: the further residents were from the asylum, the vaguer the recollections became. Yet certain individuals, those who had family ties to former staff or patients, experienced hyperreal visions, vivid enough to induce panic attacks and psychological trauma. In 2010, a small team of paranormal investigators returned to the site. Their instruments recorded fluctuations in electromagnetic fields and inexplicable temperature drops extending several blocks into town. The evidence suggested that whatever energy or memory imprint the asylum had left behind was not confined to the building itself, it had leached into the town, altering perception, memory, and emotional state. The effect was cumulative. Residents began forgetting entire periods of their lives, entire streets, and even certain people. Black Hollow became a town caught between remembered history and obliterated memory, a place where reality was fluid, and the past was optional. By the time modern historians pieced together Armitage's journals, the hidden architecture, and the reflection chamber, they realized the truth: the asylum's influence had extended far beyond its walls. Not only had patients and staff vanished, but the very collective memory of the town had been reshaped, leaving gaps that even documentary evidence could not fully bridge. And so Black Hollow exists today as a town haunted not just by a building, but by the absence of itself, the residents, the history, the memories, all subtly distorted, waiting for the next person to uncover what has been buried for generations. The disappearance of Clara Devane had haunted the asylum for decades, a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale among staff, and later, a thread in the urban legends of Black Hollow. But in 2016, nearly 62 years after she vanished beneath the East Wing floorboards, something extraordinary happened: Clara returned. Not in the way anyone expected. She didn't emerge from the forest, or stumble out of some hidden tunnel. No. Clara appeared in a state that defied reason, walking along the abandoned perimeter of the asylum, perfectly alive, unchanged by age, her uniform folded neatly in her hands. Witnesses described her as a living ghost. Those who tried to approach her found her presence disorienting, inducing nausea, vertigo, and a sense of vertiginous memory loss. The first person to encounter her was Pauline Carrington, a local historian documenting the asylum's demolition. Pauline recalled the moment vividly: "I saw her step lightly through the weeds, as if floating. She didn't speak, but her eyes, they seemed to carry decades of fear and knowledge all at once. I felt, unmoored, like I'd forgotten who I was for a moment." Clara herself seemed confused, her gaze constantly scanning the air around her. Later interviews, recorded under strict psychological supervision, revealed fragments of memory, disjointed and terrifyingly precise. "The floor, it swallowed me," she whispered. "The walls, they weren't walls, they were alive, counting, always counting." For days, Clara remained under observation in a secure facility, monitored by both psychologists and structural engineers. They discovered that her physical state was remarkably preserved. She bore no signs of aging despite having vanished in 1954. Moreover, medical scans indicated an unusual neural pattern, heightened alpha and theta brainwave activity, as if she were experiencing multiple temporal realities simultaneously. When asked to describe what had happened during her absence, Clara offered a sequence of fragmented memories. She recalled descending the secret sub-basement, stepping through hidden corridors that weren't on any blueprint, and entering the reflection chamber. In her recollection, the mirrors stretched endlessly, reflecting not only her image but layers of time itself, visions of past patients, staff, and even herself as a child. They weren't dead, not really, she said, voice trembling. They were here, beneath the floor, trapped in the hum, counting, just counting. Researchers were both horrified and fascinated. Clara claimed that the chamber acted as a temporal anchor, suspending her existence in a liminal state between the living world and the subterranean chamber's memory imprint. She described the walls pulsating with a rhythm that she now recognized as the same three-knock pattern reported by Luis Moreno and echoed throughout the asylum's history. One particularly harrowing account came when Clara described a confrontation with a shadowed figure in the chamber, someone she identified as Dr. Armitage. She insisted he had remained there, not alive in the conventional sense, but somehow intertwined with the architecture itself, observing, recording, and manipulating events across decades. He told me I must remember, or the building would forget me, Clara said. I can't explain it. I don't think I fully exist without remembering. Her descriptions aligned uncannily with previously unexplained phenomena, shifting hallways, disappearing corridors, the reflection chamber's impossible geometry. Investigators realized that Clara had been inside the chamber for over 6 decades, yet she had experienced it in subjective hours, days, and sometimes, years, a nonlinear perception of time dictated by the room's strange architecture. Clara's return was not merely a personal miracle, it was evidence of the asylum's ongoing influence. Researchers theorized that the chamber acted as both prison and observer, storing consciousness in a way that modern science could not yet explain. Her survival was a direct interaction with this latent architecture, an unintended consequence of its design. To test her memories, experts returned to the asylum site with Clara guiding them. She led them through corridors that matched the scattered fragments of Armitage's journals and old blueprints, pointing out anomalies, walls that seemed slightly misaligned, floors that dipped unexpectedly, and faint echo patterns that mirrored her descriptions of past events. At the threshold of the reflection chamber, Clara paused. Her hand hovered over a section of wall. Trembling. She whispered, almost to herself, "It wants you to see, but it doesn't want you to leave." When investigators forced open the chamber door, they found the room intact, the mirrors cracked, but the metallic hum still faintly present. Clara stepped inside, and the hum intensified. Her eyes rolled back for a brief moment, and when she blinked, she spoke words that would chill everyone present. "It's still counting. It always counts." The room seemed to respond to her presence. The reflections warped, showing layers of time overlapping, Clara as she had been in 1954, as she was now, and fleeting images of past patients whose identities had been lost to history. Every reflection showed figures performing subtle, repetitive motions, like the cadence of some invisible ritual. Following her return, Clara underwent extensive interviews and neurological testing. While the physical world accounted for some anomalies, many remained inexplicable. Her consciousness appeared partially integrated with the chamber, capable of sensing events underground without leaving her body. It became clear that the asylum's hidden spaces had created a kind of temporal echo chamber, where memories, fears, and identities became trapped and distorted across decades. Despite these revelations, Clara struggled with reintegration. She experienced severe PTSD-like symptoms, including recurring dreams of the underground corridors, auditory hallucinations of knocking, and a persistent sense of being observed. Yet she also became a key witness, the only person to recall the asylum's true underground structure in detail. Through her testimony, investigators finally understood how the hidden sub-basement, the reflection chamber, and Armitage's experiments were all interconnected, a network of spaces designed not merely to confine bodies, but to manipulate perception, memory, and the flow of consciousness itself. Clara's return was not an end, it was a doorway. A bridge between the known and the unknowable. Through her, the secrets of Black Hollow Asylum began to unfold, revealing a story of obsession, architecture, and human experimentation that had been buried for generations. And yet, as Clara would often repeat, staring at a cracked mirror late at night, the building isn't finished, and it never forgets. By 2018, the legend of Black Hollow Asylum had grown beyond local folklore into an international fascination. Researchers, journalists, paranormal experts, and urban explorers converged on the site, each hoping to witness the building's anomalies firsthand. What they found, however, was far beyond any expectation or legend. It was a labyrinth of memory, fear, and architecture that seemed alive. The investigation was coordinated by a multidisciplinary team. Archaeologists mapped the remaining foundations, psychologists interviewed surviving witnesses, and engineers conducted structural scans to uncover any hidden chambers. Yet from the first moments, the building resisted all attempts at documentation. Hallways shifted overnight. Rooms that appeared during a daytime survey vanished by nightfall. Instruments malfunctioned inexplicably. Even digital cameras recorded distorted images, static replacing the edges of doors or staircases, as if reality itself were bending around the asylum. Clara Devane became the team's most valuable guide. Despite her trauma, she could navigate areas previously inaccessible, recounting the exact location of secret tunnels and the hidden sub-basement. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the investigators. She described corridors that had no ceiling yet appeared enclosed, stairways that led downward into pitch-black voids, and floors that pulsed faintly beneath her feet, echoing the three-knock rhythm she had heard decades earlier. During their survey of the reflection chamber, the team used advanced LiDAR scanners and infrared cameras. The results were confounding. The chamber's diameter appeared larger on the scans than it measured physically. Infrared readings suggested movement beneath the floor, though no one was there. Magnetic fields fluctuated wildly, forming patterns that resembled human neural activity, synchronized to Clara's heartbeat as she walked through the space. A particularly chilling discovery came when the journalists attempted to record ambient sound. Their audio equipment picked up voices repeating words in overlapping layers. At first, the words were unintelligible, but after analysis, fragments emerged: "Don't leave. Counting. Still here. Below." 3. The three-knock motif recurred throughout the recordings, faintly echoing through the instruments and the building itself. Researchers began hypothesizing that the asylum acted as a psychophysical amplifier, somehow transmitting and recording the mental impressions of those who had spent time inside. The investigation team also located fragments of Armitage's lost patient records. Comparing them with Clara's recollections, they realized many patients listed as deceased or transferred were likely trapped within the sub-basement or the reflection chamber. These individuals had left imprints in memory and architecture, appearing in distorted visions experienced by anyone who entered the asylum, or even lived in proximity, as the phenomena in Black Hollow had demonstrated. Urban explorers added to the growing database of anomalies. One young photographer, Daniel Voss, captured images of corridors that appeared infinite, despite the building's known dimensions. Another, Samantha Riel, recorded fleeting reflections of figures not present in the room, silhouettes matching descriptions of historical patients. Even more disturbingly, multiple team members reported feeling as though someone, or something, was guiding their movements, subtly pushing them towards certain doors or hallways, and away from others. Psychologists on the team were divided. Some believed these effects were purely psychological, stress, fear, and suggestion causing hallucinations. Others posited that the building itself might be encoding consciousness, storing the perceptions, fears, and memories of anyone who spent extended periods inside. The LiDAR data, combined with infrared and magnetic anomalies, suggested a physical basis for what had previously been dismissed as supernatural. One night, the team attempted a continuous 48-hour observation inside the reflection chamber. They recorded every motion, every heartbeat, and every sound. The result was both fascinating and terrifying. The chamber's surface began to show faint distortions, moving reflections, overlapping temporal frames. Shadows coalesced in the corners, and the three-knock sequence became audible without any source. Clara, standing in the center, reported visions of past patients walking through the mirrors, performing repetitive, ritualistic motions. She whispered that they were repeating the patterns of Armitage's experiments, eternally trapped within the architecture. Engineers noticed structural anomalies as well. Certain walls had been built with unconventional materials, containing metals and alloys previously thought impossible for early 20th century construction. Floorboards contained hollow channels, and sub-basement scans revealed chambers below chambers, layers never documented in official blueprints. One team member remarked that the building resembled a layered mind, each level representing a fragment of memory or consciousness, echoing Armitage's notion of architecture that feeds on grief and fear. Journalists documented the unfolding events meticulously, but even their footage often failed to capture what the investigators experienced firsthand. Cameras glitched when capturing mirrors, staircases appeared longer or shorter than they measured, and multiple attempts to photograph Clara within the reflection chamber produced blurred images with faint silhouettes in the background. The investigation team also attempted to recreate Armitage's observational experiments, monitoring the chamber over extended periods. They noted that the hum within the reflection chamber, previously described as low-frequency and subsonic, intensified when human presence increased. Furthermore, the spatial dimensions appeared to fluctuate slightly with each entry, almost as if the building itself reacted to consciousness. Throughout the process, Clara remained the emotional and psychological anchor for the team. She described every corridor, staircase, and secret room with precision, often pausing to whisper, "It remembers me, and now it remembers you too." Investigators began to understand that the asylum's memory was cumulative, recording, storing, and replaying experiences for anyone who entered. As the 2018 investigation progressed, the team realized a horrifying possibility: the asylum had never been contained. It was spreading its influence outward, not only affecting those who entered, but those living in proximity, and anyone who engaged with its history. Black Hollow itself, as Section 7 had revealed, remained a town haunted not only by buildings but by eroded memory. The deeper the team went, the clearer it became that the investigation wasn't just about documenting a derelict structure, it was about understanding a living archive of human experience, one that blurred the lines between architecture, consciousness, and time. The asylum had been waiting decades for someone to remember it fully. And now, the world was watching. By the summer of 2019, the investigation had reached a critical point. After years of collecting data, scanning, and interviewing witnesses, the multidisciplinary team prepared to enter the deepest and most uncharted section of Black Hollow Asylum, the area beneath the reflection chamber, a place no human had fully explored in over 6 decades. The team included Clara Devane, engineers, psychologists, historians, and select paranormal investigators. Each knew that what lay ahead could change their understanding of memory, consciousness, and the building itself. The descent began in the early morning, with heavy equipment and portable lighting. As they approached the sub-basement entrance, a low hum reverberated through the floorboards above, a sound that grew louder as they neared the chamber. Clara stopped at the threshold, her hand pressed against the stone wall. Her eyes widened. "It knows we're coming," she whispered. Inside, the first corridor seemed ordinary, but the moment they switched on their lights, shadows moved along the walls, shifting in impossible ways. Corridors split and converged, and the floor beneath their feet seemed to pulse faintly, synchronizing with Clara's heartbeat. Engineers recorded structural anomalies, the walls extended farther than measurements allowed, and ceiling heights fluctuated unpredictably. The asylum was behaving like a living, responsive organism. They discovered a series of small chambers, each containing remnants of forgotten experiments. Metal tables, rusted restraints, jars with preserved tissue, and medical instruments lay scattered among piles of brittle paperwork. Many files bore the same warning found in Armitage's journals: containment breach probable. In one chamber, the team uncovered a wall-mounted contraption resembling an early EEG machine, wired into the very foundation, its purpose unclear but likely linked to Armitage's experiments with consciousness. The investigation took a chilling turn when the team reached a locked, curved corridor. Magnetic field readings spiked, causing equipment to fail. Clara stepped forward instinctively, pressing her hand to the wall. The metal surface rippled like water, and a hidden doorway opened silently. Beyond it lay the final chamber, the heart of the underground labyrinth, larger than any prior surveys had indicated. This chamber was lined with mirrors, polished steel, and stone, forming a concentric spiral that descended several feet into the earth. The center contained a circular platform with chains and straps, reminiscent of the devices Armitage had described. At the far end, a low pedestal held a thick leather-bound journal, identical in design to Armitage's missing notebooks. The team approached cautiously. As Clara opened the journal, the room's hum intensified. Her voice trembled as she read aloud passages that had never been seen before, describing experiments on perception, memory, and consciousness. The final entry was a confession. Armitage had discovered a way to merge human consciousness with the building itself, creating a persistent echo that could survive death, trapping minds in the structure. Patients like Clara and were not gone, they had been integrated into the asylum's living architecture, existing in a liminal state between reality and memory. The team realized that every strange event, every anomaly reported for decades, was evidence of this integration. The building was alive with consciousness, a repository of the forgotten, the lost, and the trapped. It had been feeding, shaping, and observing, growing stronger with every person who remembered, or forgot, it. Suddenly, reflections in the mirrors began to shift independently of the team's movements. Figures emerged, faint, translucent forms of past patients, staff, and even Armitage himself. The air became thick, vibrating with the layered echoes of decades of human thought. One investigator, Daniel Voss, described feeling as though his own memories were being scanned, images and experiences briefly replaying in his mind that were not his own. Clara guided the team through the spiral chamber, pointing out the locations of other hidden subchambers. Each contained evidence of forgotten experiments, journals, sketches, preserved biological samples, and devices designed to measure neural activity. The patterns of 3 knocks, recurring throughout the asylum's history, became unmistakable. They were a signal, a rhythm of consciousness encoded into the building's structure. In the chamber's deepest section, they found an alcove containing personal items, clothing, diaries, and photographs, belonging to patients whose existence had been erased from official records. These objects vibrated with the same hum as the chamber. Clara explained that the asylum preserved fragments of identity here, like a shadow library of human consciousness. The team attempted to map the chamber, but conventional instruments failed. LiDAR scans produced contradictory readings, showing corridors looping back impossibly, staircases vanishing and reappearing, walls stretching and shrinking. Even time seemed affected, minutes passed differently for individuals, with some reporting hours of experience in what was mere moments for others. At one point, a researcher lost consciousness briefly. When she awoke, she described standing in the chamber with an entirely different set of walls, filled with figures silently observing her. Clara warned that this was the building's defensive mechanism. When threatened or explored too aggressively, it altered spatial perception, testing those who entered and potentially trapping them within its memory loops. Despite the danger, the team pressed on. Using Clara as a guide, they uncovered a final hidden passage, sealed behind mirrored panels. Inside lay the last secret, a room containing a circular pit, filled with reflective liquid. Armitage's notes indicated that this was the core repository, where consciousness was most concentrated, the point at which the asylum's memory and the physical world intersected. Clara stepped forward, her voice barely audible. This is where it all began, and where it never ends.